Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining today's webinar on the International Conference of Harmonization E22 Draft Guideline on General Considerations for Patient Preference Studies. I'm Francesco Pignatti, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. We have an excellent program with experts who will walk us through the new guideline, followed by an interactive session where patient representatives will share their experience with preference studies. Thank you for joining us. We hope the presentations and discussions are both informative and practically useful. Please note that the views expressed by the speakers are their own and do not necessarily reflect the positions of their organizations or of the ICH. The objective of today's meeting is to introduce the guideline with the purpose of facilitating stakeholder engagement and feedback about the guideline and training material during the public consultation, which is ongoing. We have structured the meeting in three parts. In the first session, we will hear opening remarks, including our distinguished guest, Teresa Mullin. The second session is dedicated to presentations from our experts about the contents of the guideline and the training material. And after a short break, the last and perhaps the most important session of today's meeting will be a discussion with patient representatives who will tell us about their experience and initial feedback on the guideline. We plan to finish in about 3.5 hours, but this may change depending on the discussion. Before we dive into today's program, I want to thank and give credit to the many colleagues and experts from regulatory agencies, industry, and academia who have worked relentlessly over the past year to develop this draft guideline. And you will meet many of them today. This has been a truly collegial effort from across the globe, in line with the ICH spirit and practice of international collaboration to harmonize the technical requirements for pharmaceuticals for human use. I particularly want to acknowledge the leadership and contribution of Robin Bent from the United States Food and Drug Administration, who acted as regulatory chair and will moderate the key session with patients later today. It is my honor now to introduce our first speaker, Teresa Mullin. Teresa serves as the Associate Center Director for Strategic Initiatives at CEDAR, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the United States Food and Drug Administration. She oversees areas of strategic interest, leading a variety of CEDAR efforts, including patient-focused drug development and CEDAR's international program. Teresa represents the United States FDA at the ICH Assembly and Management Committee, and she currently serves as the Vice Chair of the ICH Management Committee. Today, Teresa will speak on setting the stage for ICH E22. She will provide the background of the guideline and explain how the issue of patient preference studies was elevated within ICH and how stakeholders collaborated to put patient preferences studies on the ICH agenda. Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesco. Hello, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you. We are very glad that you are able to join us for this webinar on our new ICH draft guideline on general considerations for patient preference studies, which we also refer to as E22. My name is Teresa Mullin, and I am the Associate Director for Strategic Initiatives at the U.S. FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And as Francesco said, I also serve as the Vice Chair of the ICH Management Committee. Now, within FDA, I was deeply involved in establishing the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative some years ago. And so it is my great pleasure to be here today to provide some background and opening remarks. And I want to begin by talking about why it is so critical that sponsors and regulators seek to understand and incorporate the patient's perspective in drug development and decision-making related to a particular disease or condition. Patients have direct experience living with the disease. They have firsthand knowledge of the impact of the disease on their life and on how they feel and function. They bring unique and valuable perspectives to drug development that cannot be provided by the clinical, scientific, legal, or other experts. It is important for health authorities and for drug developers to incorporate the patient's perspective early in drug discovery and development stages, and to continue through the entire drug life cycle. Throughout the drug development, there is an opportunity to increase the quality of the development program through effective inclusion of the patient's perspective. And these opportunities include, but they're not limited to, understanding the clinical context for medical development and evaluation. Product design features, including the formulation and delivery modes that minimize the burden and support patient adherence. The development of endpoints that reflect what benefits that matter the most to the patient and adverse endpoints that are the most important to patients. Designing trials that support enrollment and retention and ensure diversity of participants that are reflective of the indicated the target population, and informing regulatory decision-making, including patient acceptability of benefits versus risks. Throughout drug development, working with patients and caregivers to learn about patient perspectives can be valuable in addressing specific questions to inform drug development programs and regulatory decision-making. This, for example, what disease signs, symptoms, and impacts, and what treatment burdens matter the most to patients, and how might that be addressed by medical therapy? What's the best way to measure these effects? What impacts or concepts are most relevant to patients, and what endpoints could be constructed to capture those concepts? And how can these endpoints be incorporated into clinical trials in a way that'll be robust enough to support regulatory decision-making and inform patients and caregivers? What's a clinically meaningful change in an endpoint from a patient's perspective? And how do we define a meaningful change for a person whose condition is actually worsening over time? Questions particularly related to preference and relevant throughout the drug development include what methods and approaches could be used to identify, for example, what treatment benefits would be most desirable to obtain, what risks would be most important to avoid, and to explore what patients might consider to be an acceptable trade-off of increased harm for a specific increase in benefit for a new medical product. And how do you take into account the patient-to-patient variability? What are methodological considerations for sponsors related to the conduct of those patient preference studies in order to provide credible and reliable findings that support regulatory decision-making? These questions aren't meant to be exhaustive, but they are meant to convey that there is a range of opportunity for informing drug development and decision-making. And some research methods could be applied across a number of these questions. The ICH draft guideline that's going to be discussed today will be focusing on general considerations for those patient preference studies. Patient preference studies may be particularly valuable when you're seeking to understand how patients perceive and prioritize potential benefit outcomes and characteristics, and their views on different aspects of their condition. While the information provided by these studies doesn't replace the information provided by efficacy and safety studies, patient preference information can be valuable across different phases of drug development, pre and post-market, and this information may be considered together with the efficacy and safety information in a benefit risk assessment and related decisions by regulators. So the general considerations covered in the E22 guideline address the use, design, conduct, and analysis and submission of patient preference studies, and in particular, when these studies are aimed at informing drug development, regulatory submission, and drug approvals, and maintenance of these approvals. ICH developed a patient-focused drug development reflection paper some years ago that lays out an agenda of work to cover the range of things I've just described, and E22 work is proceeding to take care of one component of that, which is the patient preference-related questions and methodologies. This webinar will first provide you a video overview of the E22 guideline, and then an overview of the public consultation process currently underway. And as Francesco has noted, that's going to be followed by our first session with a series of presentations by the members of that ICH working group that developed the E22 draft guideline, and they will provide you more detail on the content covered in the guideline. And after the break, the second session will include that panel discussion with members of the E22 working group, but they'll be gathering feedback from invited patient perspectives from across the different regions. In closing, I want to thank you for joining this webinar. We hope you find it informative and perhaps inspiring. And during the ongoing public comment period, we also hope to hear from you. So thank you. Back to you, Francesco.
Thanks a lot, Teresa, and also on behalf of our expert working group for this clear talk, inspiring talk, making sure we put patient preference studies in the right context of all the evidence and really guiding the direction of this guideline. Teresa, your leadership made a decisive difference, and your support has been key to deliver this document. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you. I would like now to spend a few words about the many resources that the ICH Secretariat have published to support communication about the E22 guideline. Teresa already mentioned we have produced a video that you can find on the website. They are all available, these materials, on the ICH dedicated web page to E22. The explanatory video shows our colleagues from the expert group that explain the different elements of the guideline and highlight the key messages. That is an excellent starting point for anyone approaching this technical document. The video is complemented by 2 training slide decks that are also available on the ICH website. The first deck walks through the guidelines section by section and highlights the key messages, a little bit like we will do in the next session. And the second deck reinforces those messages with a concise question and answer layout and illustrative examples. And Dr. Leviton's presentation later in the program will address this training material. The Secretariat has also put together an explainer that is also very useful, and we hope that all of these materials will help become familiar with the guideline and encourage feedback during the public consultation. And this leads us to our first presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce Shata Al-Muhaidib from the Saudi Food and Drug Authority, who will describe the ICH public consultation process. Dr. Al-Muhaidib, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesco, for your nice introduction. So, good day, everyone. Thank you for your joining. Today, I will walk you through the ICH public consultation process. What is it, why it matters, and how stakeholders can meaningfully contribute. The goal is to clarify how your input at this stage directly influences the scientific quality, feasibility, and global implementation of the ICH guideline. The International Council for Harmonization, or ICH, brings together regulatory authorities and industry members to develop globally harmonized guidelines for pharmaceutical quality, safety, efficacy, and multidisciplinary topics. So these guidelines form the backbone of modern regulatory science, enabling consistency across regions and improving patient access to safe and effective therapies. The public consultation is a critical phase in the ICH guideline life cycle, which ensures a transparency, global stakeholders engagement, and scientific robustness before any final adaptation. Next. So the ICH guideline moved through a structured development pathway. Step 1 is a scientific drafting by the expert working group. Step 2 is a formal adoption of the draft guideline for public consultation. Step 3, which is the focus of this session, is where global regulatory consultation and public input occur, moving towards Step 4, which is a final adoption by the ICH Assembly, and Step 5 is the regional implementation by regulatory authorities. Next. So the public consultation is not just a procedural step. It is a quality and feasibility safeguard. It ensures that the guideline reflects real-world scientific challenges, operational feasibility, and regional nonsense. It helps identify gaps, clarify definitions, and enhance implementability. Ultimately, this step helps make the guidelines stronger, clearer, and globally acceptable. Next. Public consultation is open to a broad community, regulatories, industry association, pharmaceutical companies, clinical researchers, academia, and patient groups, technology experts as well, and individual professionals. They all can contribute. The diversity of perspectives is essential, especially for guideline that attempts to harmonize topic, which is heterogenic topic by nature. Next. Once a draft guideline reaches step 2, it is posted on the ICH website, and each regulatory region opens its own consultation portal. Then stakeholders can provide comments using regional templates and submit them to their regulatory authorities. Make sure that the deadline of the respective regulatory authority is followed. So then each authority will consolidate and review the feedback before submitting a unified regional response to the ICH working group. Next. During step 3, each region perform an internal scientific review of all comments received. The technical teams evaluate the relevance, impact, and scientific rationale behind each comment. Next. So comments are categorized into scientific, operational, editorial, and implementation issues. This ensures a structured feedback is provided to the ICH working group. Next. Every comment is reviewed by the working group. In countries where the consultation process takes place in language other than English, the comment will be translated and shared with the working group. It's most helpful for our review of people submitting comments use the ICH public consultation comments template in a form of Microsoft Excel or a Word document rather than in a PDF format when permitted by the regional authority. It's very helpful if stakeholders only submit their comments to one region. We will review all comments as a group, so there is no benefit to the same organization submitting the same comments to multiple authorities, but it will create additional workload and it will delay the review process by the working group. So it's very helpful as well for people to tell us not only what they don't like in the document and what they think is missing from the document, but we would like also to hear and know from you what you particularly find useful in the guideline. So it can be hard when reviewing a comments to understand what to keep and what to change, because we typically get comments focused on what should be changed. If there is something you really want to keep it as is, please let us know. So next, the ICH working group then reviews all consolidated comments from every region. They discuss areas of convergence and divergence, refine the text, clarify requirements, and resolve inconsistencies. This stage can involve several rounds of discussion until consensus is reached. So the outcome is a technically robust and globally harmonized guideline ready for step 4 adoption. Next. As we move forward, the public consultation period has begun, and this is the moment where your scientific, operational, and implementation insight can meaningfully shape the final ICH guideline. So your perspective truly matters. The strength of the final guidelines depends directly on the quality and diversity of the comments received at this stage. So I encourage everyone to take the time to review the draft and contribute your feedback. Thank you, and going back to you, Francesca.
Thank you very much, Shata. So constructive comments and choose your channel of comments during the public consultation and not submit on multiple channels for efficient commenting. Okay, so we now move to session 1, which is the overview and key concepts in the guideline. In this session, expert working group members will present key aspects of the E22 guideline, and we will focus on use cases and methodological considerations and training materials. Our first speaker, Shun Tezuka from the Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices Agency of Japan, will discuss purpose, scope, and key concepts of the guideline. Shun, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Francesco. I'm Shun Tezuka, a medical officer at PMDA, the regulatory agency of Japan. I'd like to introduce the purpose, scope and key concepts of the E22 guideline. Next slide, please. Okay, let me start with the key principles of the E22 guideline. Patients who have experience or knowledge of a disease and its treatments provide relevant perspectives. Understanding these qualitative and quantitative insights is important for various aspects of drug development, such as identifying unmet needs, designing clinical studies, and interpreting results. Next slide. So what are patient preference studies? PPS for short. Patient preference studies aim to assess the relative desirability or acceptability of actual or potential health interventions, or their characteristics and outcomes, for example, efficacy and safety outcomes. Patient preference studies can generate structured insights about the relative importance of characteristics, also referred to as attributes, that are considered by patients when making decisions about drugs. Next slide. Continuing with key principles. Patient preference studies may be considered together with the efficacy and safety information in the benefit risk assessment of drugs and related regulatory submissions. The information provided by patient preference studies does not replace the information provided by efficacy and safety studies. The E22 guideline does encourage the consideration of patient preference studies, but does not require that patient preference studies be conducted for every drug development program. Next slide. This is the purpose of the E22 guideline. The purpose is to outline general considerations about the use, design, conduct, analysis, and submission of patient preference studies aimed at informing drug development, regulatory submission and evaluation, drug approvals, and maintenance of such approvals. Preference research is a large and evolving field. As such, the E22 guideline provides general consideration and scientific principles rather than detailed technical instructions. So this is a high-level guideline. Here is the table of contents of the guideline. First, introduction. Second, general principles. Third, patient preference studies in drug development and post-marketing evaluations. And lastly, recommendation and practical consideration for patient preference studies. My part covers the content from section 1 and 2. Next slide. Scope of the guideline. The focus of the E22 guideline is on patient preference studies using stated preference methods. Studies where patients are asked to state their choice through surveys or interviews. For stated preference methods, hypothetical scenarios are used. Since patients are evaluating characteristics of potential drugs and not actual drugs, the E22 guideline may be applicable to similar and potentially useful studies. For example, caregiver or revealed preference studies, but these are outside the scope. The placement of patient preference studies data and labeling is also outside the scope. Next slide. For the final 3 slides of my part, I'll introduce the general principles applicable to other types of studies involving human participants, including ethical conduct, compliance with the protocol, protection of personal data, and quality standards are applicable to patient preference studies as well. Thorough preliminary research is important to ensure all relevant information is included in the patient preference study design. De novo work may not always be justified, aiming to avoid unnecessary burden on the patient community. Next slide. As the E22 is an ICH guideline, global applicability is one of the important points. Patient preference studies conducted in other regions may inform regulatory drug assessment in the local region. For example, results from region Y, the region studied in the patient preference studies, may be applied to region X, the region not studied in the patient preference studies. The degree of applicability of patient preference studies results from other regions to the local region should be evaluated and justified. The applicant may find this topic useful to discuss prospectively with the relevant regulatory authorities. Next slide. This is my last slide. Early consideration and planning are critical. The usefulness of patient preference studies should be considered systematically throughout drug development, beginning as early as possible. Patient input is variable throughout patient preference studies development. Details will be covered in a later session. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Shun. Very clear. I really like the emphasis you put on the fact that these studies provide insights on the relative importance of treatment characteristics are in that sense a little bit different from the studies that we're used to seeing in drug developments, which are more about the outcomes. So it takes a little bit of thinking about really the difference of this type of studies, and that's also the relevance of this guideline in introducing them. I also like the fact that you remind us that this is a rapidly evolving field, and I guess people will realize that the guideline is at the level of general principles. By necessity, cannot be very prescriptive in terms of specific methods, and also that the issue of general applicability is a very important one, and you will see that in the next presentation as well. So thank you, Dr. Tezuka. Our next speaker is Brett Hauber, representing PhRMA, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. Dr. Hauber will tell us about the common use of patient preference studies. Brett.
Thank you, Francesco. If we could go to the next slide, please. I'll be focusing on section 3.2 of the guideline, which presents a number of common uses of patient preference studies. On this list, you'll see 9 uses that span the range of the project lifecycle. First, in defining the therapeutic context, including identifying patients' treatment priorities, identifying treatment characteristics that matter to patients, including mode of administration. In the design of clinical studies, including informing recruitment and retention strategies for clinical studies, informing the acceptability of protocol visits and procedures, informing the selection of clinical study outcomes and clinical trial endpoints. They also can be used in the interpretation of clinical trial results, including interpreting the relative importance of different components of an endpoint with multiple components, informing whether or not the change in an endpoint observed in a clinical trial is meaningful to patients, and provide information on the acceptability of benefit-risk trade-offs of a medicinal product. Patient preference studies can also be used to inform the acceptability of risk management or mitigation strategies in post-marketing. The training materials accompanying the guideline, which are available on the ICH website and which will be described more later in this webinar, include illustrative examples of 3 of these use cases, specifically using patient preference studies to support endpoint selection in a clinical trial, informing the amount of change in endpoints that would be meaningful to patients, and using patient preference studies to inform benefit-risk evaluation. Next slide, please. In addition to the list of 9 potential uses in section 3.2, the guideline describes uses of patient preference studies in specific contexts. In early development, patient preference studies can be used to provide information about unmet needs, information about patients' priorities for disease management, and information about patients' willingness to participate in clinical trials. This type of early information is often, but not always, qualitative. And the guidance notes as well that early qualitative studies undertaken for these purposes and other purposes in early development can be used to inform the development of quantitative patient preference studies later in development. Next slide, please. As mentioned previously, there may be unique opportunities to use patient preference studies in clinical trial design. First, patient preference studies can inform the basis of the development, selection, and prioritization of endpoints. Patient preference studies might inform weighting or scoring of individual endpoint elements in a multi-component endpoint, as well as informing whether the magnitude of change in an endpoint is considered meaningful from the patient's perspective. Next slide, please. Once the clinical trial results are available, patient preference studies can provide information to inform the interpretation of trial results, the trade-offs patients are willing to make among specific attributes of the drug, or the likelihood that patients would consider the benefits of the drug to outweigh the risks. The guideline notes specifically that when treatment choices are associated with high risks or high uncertainty, for example, in rare but life-threatening adverse events in treatments with uncertainty regarding long-term safety, patient preferences may provide measures of risk thresholds that can inform benefit-risk assessment. And as described above, patient preference studies may be used to inform the development of risk mitigation strategies and risk minimization and management plans. Next slide, please. Section 3.2 of the guidance concludes with the discussion of a concept known as preference heterogeneity. Preference heterogeneity refers to the distribution of preferences within a population. It can provide information which can be used to inform things like the proportion of the population that is likely to prefer one set of treatment outcomes to another, differences in treatment priorities within the population, and to test for differences in preferences between specific subgroups of patients. That is the end of my slide, so I'll turn it back to Francesco at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Brett. Very clear presentation on the multiple uses, and it links well with the concept that Shun alluded to that is key in this guideline, which is that patient preference studies should be considered throughout the development, and it's not a one-off at one specific point. And of course, you focused, Brett, on the uses within the confines, the scope of this guideline, pharmaceutical and drug development. But of course, there are wider uses that this guideline does not address. But thank you for this very clear presentation. We now move to the next talk. Our next speaker is Laura Lee Johnson from the US Food and Drug Administration. She will tell us about the methodological aspects of the E22 guideline. Laura Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesco, and welcome everybody. Next slide. I'm going to go over what is predominantly covered in section 4 of the guideline. And as my colleagues have mentioned, this is a rapidly evolving field. I also want to mention that our overarching principles, and you'll hear this throughout the day today and notice it as you read the guideline, is that just like any other scientific study, patient preference studies should follow internationally recognized scientific standards and recognized practices. And it's up to the applicant to explain how the results are intended to support their regulatory submission to justify that the data submitted meet the regulatory requirement. Next slide, please. So, like all good scientific studies, we start with the research objective and the research question. So, what is a research objective for a patient preference study? It's going to describe what the study is intended to inform in drug development and evaluation. So, for example, to inform the benefit-risk assessment of a drug. Now, from there, you want to then refine that research objective into answerable questions. And if you're used to clinical trials, you might be thinking about hypotheses and hypothesis tests. And again, it needs to be an answerable question For example, to assess the levels of risks that these patient preference study participants would be accepting in exchange for a specified improvements in efficacy. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later today. Now, when available, the interaction with regulatory authorities can be very useful to ensure that that patient preference study is going to meet regulatory expectations. So these aren't marketing studies. These are scientific studies done with a regulatory intent. That is the focus of E22. Next slide, please. Study design and method selection is an important part of what we cover, but as my colleagues have mentioned, this is a rapidly evolving field. We mention these today to give a little bit of context, but the guideline is general. It is not going to go in and describe each of the methods, and this is very common for many other ICH guidelines as well. But that choice of method is going to depend on many different factors. So again, similar to every research study, you choose your method based on the research question, the patient population, and in this case, those number of attributes or scenarios that you want to assess. So there's a lot of published literature on many different methods, both qualitative and quantitative. Again, an important part that you hear across our different presentations is that there is this mixture of qualitative and quantitative methods. So for qualitative methods, examples of those are interviews, focus groups, where they gather groups of people together and do interviews and discussions that way. Delphi panels, and there are many, many other types of qualitative methods that you might see. Quantitative methods often include discrete choice experiments, or DCEs. Threshold techniques, there are different types of something called best-worst scaling, swing weighting, and many other types of methods. Now, what's also important is that a study is not limited to a single method. It might include qualitative and quantitative approaches, and that's what's often referred to as a mixed methods approach. There should be a very clear rationale for the choice of methods used in that patient preference study. And again, similar to all of the other studies that we see as regulators coming in. Next slide, please. So the next important element here is your study sample. Typically, that patient preference study should include a sample that is representative of the target population. And if there's a mismatch there, that can limit the generalizability and the applicability of the patient preference study findings. The key characteristics that we consider when you're developing a sampling plan would be those participant characteristics. So for example, if you do a patient preference study in people that have mild and moderate disease, but you want to apply those findings in a group of patients where what you're looking at is people that have moderate to severe disease, this may not be applicable. It may or it may not. So thinking about different participant characteristics, thinking about the disease characteristics, also the treatment characteristics, and other characteristics that may come up as you're discussing what's important in that study sample, and also thinking about what type of representation you're looking for. Now, as many of our colleagues have mentioned, because we are here for ICH, when data are used across regions, we need to consider the similarity of the culture and healthcare of a local region compared to other regions as well. Next slide, please. We also need to think about that recruitment strategy. So consider if the strategies for recruiting study participants can impact the representativeness of that target population and justify the strategy. So when we're looking at the documents, to think about where are the sources from where you're recruiting participants? How is eligibility determined? And describe any limitations or potential biases that could be coming out of this. If the study is planned to include different populations than the target population of the regulatory submission, the study report needs to include a discussion that supports the relevance of the patient preference study. Next slide, please. Now, sample size for patient preference studies, this is where things are in some ways different than what you might see in a clinical trial. So, when I first learned how to do clinical trials, you get a formula, right? For different types of trials, different types of analyses. There's some basic equations that you use to calculate a sample size. You're probably not going to see that for the patient preference studies, but the general principles behind sample size are still here. The determination is going to vary quite a bit depending on the research question and depending on the method. A larger sample generally will provide more precise estimates of preferences and generally will have better generalizability to the target population. Again, depends on the representativeness of the sample, but typically larger will be better in the sense of more precision and better generalizability. Now, I'm going to, for the next several slides, break quite a bit up about qualitative patient preference studies and quantitative patient preference studies. So qualitative studies, so these are those focus groups and patient interviews. These tend to be smaller than the quantitative studies. And again, an emphasis on sample size here is to include the diverse perspectives and capture variability in preferences. So this is the base that you are going to build the quantitative patient preference study on. So you want to make sure to include those diverse perspectives. Quantitative patient preference studies need to be large enough that using the methods and analyses that are going to be employed, that you can ensure a desired level of precision. If subgroup differences and preferences are assessed, that sample should include sufficient participants in each subgroup. Again, sounds a lot like a clinical trial. Depends on the complexity of your patient preference study when you're thinking about the sample size. If you have a very complex study, your sample size will likely necessarily be larger. Next slide. So a common set of words that you've already heard me say a little bit here are attributes and levels. So an attribute is the specific characteristic of a drug or a treatment that the patients are going to be considering when making treatment decisions. So it might be an efficacy outcome, could be side effects, could be frequency of dosing, route of administration. So what's the characteristic that we're going to be asking the patient about and that they would be considering? Then we also have the attribute levels. And so that's the levels of that characteristic, of that attribute, that are the different values that could be presented to the participants, maybe in a survey, or that we would be wanting to consider. So a simple example, if I'm interested in the risk of a certain side effect, say the risk of X, what are the different attribute levels? Well, if the risk of that side effect, I might say in that survey, 3 out of 100 people experience it, 5 out of 100 people experience it, 8 out of 100 people experience it. The attribute levels are going through the different levels that we're going to ask about when we're asking about the risk of that side effect. Next slide, please. Now, how are we going to consider which attributes to list and which levels to list? The attributes need to be relevant for the patients, the research objective, and the question. This is a great place to engage patients in trying to select and deciding which attributes to select. What you do want to avoid are attributes that are known to be irrelevant or that may increase burden. This is also a place that we need to think about the different stakeholders for your study. Who is going to be using it? And sometimes regulators may be very interested in certain attributes. And that's something, again, to really consider as you're making a decision about what to include or not include. The attribute levels. So again, the range of potential values you're going to be asking about when you're asking about these attributes, they need to capture the plausible range of values for each attribute. So let's say on our previous slide, we had 3 out of 100 up to 8 out of 100. But what if actually the risk of that side effect is 12 out of 100? We're not going to be able to extrapolate to that. So it's important to really, in those attribute levels, capture a plausible range of values for each attribute. Now, if the objective of this study is to inform benefit risk assessment, and again, there are many, many patient preference studies that do not inform benefit risk assessment. But if your objective is benefit risk assessment, excuse me, it's important to consider the alignment of those attributes to the endpoint in the clinical studies. Notice I said alignment. It may not be exactly identically worded, but there should be alignment. And again, this is a good place that if you can talk to the regulators to make sure that your view of alignment, if you're a non-regulator, aligns. But it's not going to, it needs to be generally aligned. On attribute levels, you want expected efficacy and safety information from clinical studies when that is available to use that to inform your range of levels. But again, I want to emphasize that omitting relevant attributes or using attribute levels that do not cover the relevant values expected in the clinical studies, and this is both treatment and control groups, this will limit the usefulness of that patient preference study. So do remember, we have to look at everything in the study, not just expectations about a treatment group. Next slide, please. Instrument design. So here again, even outside of patient preference studies, if there are interviews or surveys, we would want to see them, and we definitely need to see them for the patient preference studies, and to think about these key considerations, that they are clear, they are comprehensible, that they are relevant to the participants. We need to take steps to minimize the potential bias that could creep in to the questions and how we are running the interviews. Key considerations that we cover in E22 are the context. So defining the study's context, provide a clear scenario that participants are expected to think about. And we also want to make sure that things are presented and described in a manner that's realistic and does not bias responses. So thinking about the context, for example, if you're interviewing patients who are hospitalized and asking them questions, are they thinking about themselves there in a hospital bed? Are they thinking about themselves 2 weeks ago or where they expect to be a month later? Setting the very clear scenario of what they're expected to think about is really important. Next slide. So I'll go through briefly some of the other items that were on that list. As part of the instrument design, we need to be very cognizant of the presentation of the information. Those attributes and other relevant information should be described so that they are interpreted by everybody who will be engaged in the study as intended. It should be interpreted consistently, and it should be interpreted unambiguously across all of the participants. This is particularly important when you're looking at multi-regional or multilingual studies. Numeracy is also an issue. There are many folks that you need to think about that presentation of the information. Did people understand the numbers and how they were presented? The complexity, and this comes up not just in interviews, but especially in surveys. It might be that if there are some fairly simple questions and considerations, people can do more of them. But if there are very complex things that they need to think through, there may be fewer questions or items that are asked or tasks. Minimizing the cognitive bias, description of the attributes and levels. These are all things to really deeply consider, and how are people viewing this information and how are they interpreting it? Next slide, please. And this leads to some quality checks. So before I go into quality checks, I do want to make a small point that most quality checks in and of themselves. So alone, they cannot definitively identify a response that should be removed from the analysis set. So, similar to how people may say, oh, well, that's an outlier, just drop that number. And like, no, you have to think about the broader context. You do need to consider early, both in the instrument design and then also in the analysis plan, how to institute those quality checks. So you want to not add unnecessary burden. Again, there are ways to try to add too much, but there should be consideration in the design for adding questions. So something called a dominated choice task. So this is checking for illogical responses. Now, an example, though, we thought we had a dominated choice task. The small group that was working on the survey thought clearly the answer had to be, and nobody would ever choose the other. And then a slightly larger group of people looked at it, and a handful of people chose that other task. And so there was a discussion chose the other option. And there was a discussion as to why. And we realized that, in fact, this was not the dominated choice task that we thought it was. But this is going back to that first caveat. In and of itself was not going to definitively identify responses that should be removed. But sometimes these can be set up. And sometimes you can also include different questions that are asking for the same information. And then in the analysis, you're going to look to see if you got the same answer. But again, sometimes that's helpful, and other times you realize that maybe you were not, in fact, asking for exactly the same information, and that's the reason there were different answers. The time taken to complete a survey is also captured to assess what's called speeding. Another story, someone that said, oh, well, these folks are answering way too quickly, and we should remove the data. And it turned out it was all of the young people in the study that were answering very quickly. And when they did further work and they talked and they looked through some of the information they had, they found that actually they were thinking about it and they were just very quick. So it is, again, sometimes very useful and informative. So because it can pick up issues, but it does need to be considered and not just an immediate removal from the analysis set. Now, along with the design, you want to have commiserate analysis. So there's something in the analysis design that you may want to think about for attribute non-attendance. So thinking about, are participants consistently ignoring certain attributes? And that can give, again, some interesting information. Illogical responses, which ties to some of those added questions, but also fraudulent responses. Trying to understand, and this is getting more and more difficult, was there a bot that was answering this survey, or was there a human answering this survey? Inconsistencies in responses from the same participant, again, ties with part of those design and adding questions that you want to include in your analysis plan, a way to assess your quality checks and think through what you're going to do with those answers. Next slide, please. Now, many of the examples I mentioned on the last slide, we figured out we had issues during what's called pre-testing and piloting. In the pre-testing, the goal here is an initial evaluation phase where an instrument is reviewed by a set of patients to identify any issues with comprehension or interpretation of the content, the wording, or the format. We use this to refine the instrument such that the questions are going to be clear, going to be relevant, and understandable before launching into the bigger study. Piloting happens after this. So piloting is going to be a more comprehensive test of this instrument, but under the actual study conditions. So if you're going to be delivering it on a phone, like it's programmed, you have the phone. This is going to use a larger sample than in the pre-testing phase, and it's going to identify issues regarding feasibility, data quality, and logistics. Reasonably, I wish more clinical trials did this. This is very common, and it's encouraged strongly and part of how patient preference studies have been conducted over the years. And it's an important part for any data quality and work to try to have good data coming in from trials and studies. And that's true outside the patient preference space as well. Next slide, please. So pre-testing, here, again, I'm going to break up our qualitative and our quantitative. What does pre-testing look like for a qualitative patient preference study? We're going to conduct a few initial interviews to evaluate the interview guide, identify any issues with the flow of the interview, how people are understanding those questions, and the overall structure. And what we do with this feedback in the pre-testing stage is we're going to use it to refine the interview guides, maybe make it more effective for capturing the rich qualitative data that we need. Pre-testing in a quantitative study, so in a survey type of study, we're going to be administering that survey to a small representative sample of the target population, usually via a cognitive interview. And so here we're going to probably do this iteratively using a think aloud technique. And some of my colleagues will discuss a little bit more about this later today. We're going to assess in this quantitative pre-testing if the questions are understood as intended. Are there any ambiguities or biases that need to be addressed as we're finalizing that survey? And the feedback is going to be used to make any necessary revisions to the survey before it's rolled out on the larger scale. Next slide, please. Now on piloting is for the qualitative studies, identifying issues with the question wording, the interview length, the interviewer's approach. So for example, if they thought the interview was going to last 20 minutes, and instead it turns out to cover even half the material, it's 40 minutes, that's something that you want to find out, but kind of you're doing it real time instead of doing those check-ins. On the quantitative patient preference studies, here's where we're going to detect the technical or display issues with the electronic administration, the presence of high dropout rates. It might be that when they actually are trying to do it, that people are having trouble getting past question 3, it's dropping them out. So when you look at the data from the piloting, you go, why do I have such a high dropout rate here? What is wrong? Or people may say, hey, this, like I can't even get it to load on my Android device, but other people can on a different device. What's happening? I may find out that the data is not transmitting. This is also an issue. So at this quantitative piloting, we're going to take the results also of the quality checks that were put in, use that to help facilitate, early identification of any potential bias, and also use this pilot information to think about if we need to have any revisions to our statistical analysis plan and other statistical considerations. Next slide, please. So yes, analysis plans. Whenever it doesn't matter if it's a descriptive or an inferential analysis. So for your qualitative, quantitative data, any type of analysis, you should have an analysis plan for these studies. The analysis is going to address those research objectives and questions, and it should follow the recommended practices. You want to develop a pre-specified analysis plan, and it should define the research question, the methods, the statistical methods that are going to be used, define the analysis sets, how missing data is going to be handled, what are the subgroups that you want to look at, and also, if you are testing hypotheses, what are the hypothesis tests? Again, for those quantitative patient preference studies, the analysis plan also needs to include how you're going to handle the outcome of those quality checks. Now, you may decide that there needs to be deviations from that pre-specified analysis plan. Those should be justified in your report and in your submission. Sensitivity analyses are also often pre-planned and are used to assess the robustness of the primary analysis results, and thinking about checking those conclusions if there are changes under and deviations to the assumptions. It might be because of the assumptions of the methods or limitations of the data. So sensitivity and other supplementary analyses are really important here as well. Next slide, please. So now when you need to submit information to one of the regulatory agencies, your submission would go into the Common Technical Document, or CTD, and this is how you assemble the information to go to regulators. So there are different types, and we walked through this in the last section of the guideline. An important part to remember is your research objectives, your questions, the methods. That may seem to be written differently for patient preference studies, but what the guideline emphasizes is good science, research principles are all the same for any type of program. And so the FDA United States public comment period is now started, and that is part of the ICH public consultation process. Thank you very much, and good luck with all of your studies. We're very excited. Francesca?
Thank you, Laura Lee. And please can you stay one moment, because I really want to thank you for this presentation that showed not only the range of topics that this guideline has to address, but also to some extent, although you say these are general principles, there is enough content also for the more methodological minded to really appreciate how these studies fit in the whole picture of drug development. And as Shun said, this is a developing field. You presented there are a number of different methods. There is even a classification of methods into qualitative, quantitative, and of course, the purpose, the objective of the study will also inform the choice of methods, but it's often not let's say a one-off. It can be an iterative process. It can be a mixture of methods. And then if we put this on one side and on the other side, that these studies can be really critical in informing the design, for example, of clinical studies or the evaluation, I wonder, does the guideline give suggestions on interacting with regulators to consult whether the overall strategy or the details are let's say appropriate for the type of purpose?
So yes and no. A lot of the interactions with regulators is regional, and so you will not see listed in the guideline this is exactly how you talk to every regulator around the world, because that's not possible. However, what we do try to pull into the guideline is to say at these certain points, if regulatory advice is available, this is a good time to seek it. And I do think it is important, as you mentioned, we have a lot of different areas where patient preference studies can be used. It's not only for benefit risk. I think they're some of the most important places where you can use it is to try to decide and justify the endpoints that might be used in a trial and kind of where they are as you are trying to test. But those are also discussions that you would have with a regulator many times as you're trying to say, this is why I'm designing this trial this way. This is my justification. Now what they're actually going to talk about is the trial, but you're providing the justification for different design elements of the clinical trial. And it's just part of that may come from the support may come from the patient preference study. And this is discussed in one of our examples as well. When you look at the information online for the training materials, this type of interaction and potential interaction is there. But it is important when you are doing submissions that it is very clear in your report and in where you are talking about that patient preference study that you're telling the regulators why they should be using this. What is the interpretation of the study? Don't just drop information in, actually integrate it. And this is discussed well also in other ICH guidelines. And while it ties more many times to the benefit risk section, I think similar thought processes apply for all of the other ones as well.
Thank you very much, Laura Lee. And thanks to all the speakers for being perfectly on time. Our next speaker is Sheila Dickinson as a representative of the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, EFPIA. Sheila will present how the guideline highlights the importance of patient input into the development of patient preference studies. Sheila.
Thank you, Francesco. Next slide, please. So before we get into what the guidance says about patient input to patient preferences, first of all, we'll take a quick step back and talk about why this matters. So as we've heard a couple of times already today, one of the key principles that we're following here is that patients who experience a disease or use drugs can provide relevant perspective on the disease outcome and can provide information about their views on the effects of drugs and other health interventions. This is the point that patients are experts in their own experience of the disease. And so we're talking today about patient preference studies because that's one tool for capturing the patient's perspective, which we think is important. And what I'm going to be talking about specifically is that best practice when doing patient preference studies means involving patients in the study activities. Next slide, please. So slightly confusingly, we've been talking about patients a lot here. Mostly we're talking about patients as participants in the preference study, but for this slide, we're talking about patients who are collaborating in the development of a preference study, so a slightly different role. So what the guidance says is that patient input is valuable throughout the development of a patient preference study. And this input can be across a very wide range of activities. It can go from identifying the use of a preference study. It can include giving input to the design of a preference study. It can cover topics such as feasibility challenges, identifying feasibility challenges in the conduct of a preference study. It also includes developing a patient preference study protocol. It can also cover selecting attributes. This is something we heard a moment ago from Laura Lee, that patient input into the selection of attributes and the attribute levels can be really valuable. And then also it can be useful in contextualizing the patient preference study findings and highlighting how the preference study findings can have practical applications. So this may sound a little bit dry and theoretical, but just to flag that anybody I've ever talked to who's done a preference study will tell you that they learned something very valuable from working with patients on the design of a preference study. Next slide, please. So this is something that is covered not just in the E22 guideline, but also in the illustrative examples that we'll be hearing about more in just a moment. So what we can see on this slide is a very simplified schematic of how a preference study is done, the black arrows across the middle of the slide. And then in the bubbles in blue, we can see examples from these illustrative examples of where the patient input can be valuable. So for example, when you're thinking about the research objective and the research question of a preference study, This is a point when it's helpful to engage patients to understand how patients might view the particular research objective, research question that you have in mind. If we come to the attributes and levels topic, again, we heard it from Laura Lee, it's mentioned in the illustrative example. This is a point when, ideally the preference study team will be aware of the importance of engaging patients in selecting the attributes that go into the patient preference study. And then when we come to the reporting stage, this is a point when, again, we see in our illustrative example, we would suggest that the preference study results should be shared with the patient advocacy group that you were theoretically working with on this preference study. And I think this is something we're going to hear about some more in session 2 of today's meeting. Thank you. Next slide, please. I think that's the end of my section.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Very clear and very important, particularly for patient preference studies, as for many other types of studies, the role of patient. Sheila, would it be correct to say that patients should be systematically involved in the study teams when designing patient preference studies, and does the guideline address the multidisciplinary study teams?
So the guideline covers the fact that a preference study team should include multidisciplinary expertise. So the study team should include expertise in preference methodology. It should include expertise in the clinical area that the preference study is focusing on. And the guidance as well explains, as we've just discussed, the importance of engaging patients throughout the development of a preference study.
Thank you, Sheila, very clear. Our last talk for this first session is about the training materials, which are articulated in 2 formats, possible frequently asked questions and examples, and will be presented by Bennett Leviton from the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. Over to you, Bennett.
Thank you, Francesco, and good day, everybody. So I'll be taking you through the E22 Guideline training materials, and there are 2 components to those: the frequently asked questions, or FAQ, and illustrative examples. Now, all this training material, it's available with the guideline itself, and in the public comment period, we're hoping you'll provide comments on the training materials too, because they'll be very valuable for so many people. So let's start, next slide, with the FAQ. So the FAQ questions are going to focus on key points from the guideline. The answers actually do not add new information. They're really going to, from the guideline, they're going to call out key points from the guideline. And I'll walk through a few of them, the ones in boldface. The full FAQ is available in the E22 training materials, and it has more detail than we'll be going through in these examples here. So the 3 questions that we'll go through are particularly important. Next slide. So a common question is, does this guideline require that a preference study, a patient preference study, or PPS, be conducted as part of every drug development program? And the answer is no, it does not require that you do a preference study for every program, but it does encourage that you think about it. You consider whether a patient preference study would be helpful if it could enhance your understanding of the patient perspective, or it can inform the type of decisions you're going to make. And you want to evaluate whether a preference study would be useful, but you also want to ask, does a high-quality preference study already exist? Has it been published? So if it has, you may not need to do new work. In other cases, a preference study might be useful, but it may just be too much burden on patients or too difficult to do and not justify the effort. So that's part of the judgment call that you're going to have to make, and it also could be made in talking with a health authority. Next slide. So another common question is, how do preference studies and patient-reported outcomes differ? So they're both forms of patient experience data, which is a formal term from 21st century cures and other sources, but they differ in both their purpose and the type of role they play in providing evidence for patient-focused drug development. So a preference study is going to tell you or elicit how patients value different treatments or the properties of the treatments, the characteristics or attributes, and the kind of trade-offs patients might be willing to make between those properties, like between the benefit and the risk. And they can inform, say, endpoint selection, benefit risk. You've heard those examples earlier. Now, a pro measure, well, it also gets information from patients, but it captures directly how a patient feels or functions or survives relative to the disease or treatment that they're experiencing. Indirectly, you don't have another person intervene. And those can be outcomes, reflecting symptoms or daily functioning or quality of life. Now, it's not on the slide, but in my view, one of the big differences is a pro measure applies as an outcome in the trial, and the treatment has to exist because the patient has to experience it. A preference study is telling you something about the treatment of the future that you might want to have. So the treatment doesn't have to exist, but it often or very rarely could you actually use it as an endpoint in a trial. So they have different roles. Next slide. So the third question, fact that I'll take you through is, should the preference study be done in exactly the same patients or the same condition to which the preference study's results will be applied, the same type of patients? So ideally, the preference study should be based on a sample that's representative of the target population of your submission, the same condition, the same circumstances, the same demographic, the same disease and treatment characteristics. And if Laura Lee was mentioning earlier, if there's a mismatch, it can limit the generalizability and applicability. But you may not always be able to get a match. For example, it just may be too burdensome to do a preference survey of these patients during that period when that matches the target sample. Or the patients may only be briefly available during the acute phase that matches the target population. Or the condition itself might just preclude completing a survey. The patients may simply be unable to do it. There are many other reasons. So it's not unrealistic that you'll have a mismatch. And what you want to do is discuss options with the health authorities, maybe with a patient advocacy group, and come up with a justification for the degree to which you think the results from your preference survey can apply to the target population. And it's not uncommon. So it's something that you'll really want to think about. So that's it for the fact examples we're going to go through. Next slide. So we also have what we call illustrative examples. And they're illustrative because they're sort of half generic, half mock case study. There are going to be two examples in the training materials. We'll go through the first one here. And what I'll go through here is high level compared to what's actually in the training module. In this one, we're going to look at using a preference study to support choosing an endpoint for a clinical trial. So next slide. So here's the scenario. We're thinking about a disease where there's very little experience with measuring efficacy in clinical trials. So it could be a rare disease or a disease people have rarely studied before for whatever reason. And the researcher is developing a new medical product in this disease. And there are a whole bunch of ideas, but they really don't know what's the right way to measure efficacy for regulatory purposes. So they consider engaging patients to figure out what's the highest priority for the patient or higher priorities to address the unmet need and potential endpoints. And amongst the ways being considered, they decide to go forward with a patient preference study to inform endpoint selection, particularly for efficacy endpoints. Next slide. So the first thing is to think about what is your research objective versus your research question. And the distinction is subtle sometimes, but very important. The research objective here is to identify the efficacy endpoints that are most important to patients with this disease for purposes of trial design. Now, you design the research questions, you design a preference studies research questions to address those research objectives. And in this case, there are two questions. One is to assess the relative importance of the treatment attributes amongst the patients with the disease. And the second is to assess what is the degree of change in these attributes that would be meaningful to patients. Now, to start this off, we did a literature review and found that there weren't any relevant or well-conducted preference studies addressing these questions. So it was justified to do a de novo preference study. Next slide. So we begin developing the protocol, and you'll see that the protocol can't just be started, it can only be started at this point. There's a lot of stuff you have to go through, particularly the qualitative work, before you're in a position to put a full quantitative protocol together. So we use a mixed methods approach. It starts with qualitative interviews to get with patients to get a preliminary list of the attributes and how to describe them. And the description is important because trial endpoints are very technical. The language used in them is more from the statistical and clinical world, and they don't always lend themselves to a clear description to patients. So you sometimes have to work hard to translate a trial endpoint into something that could work in a preference study. And the researcher here chose to work with a patient advocacy group to ensure that the questions are relevant, to help with recruitment, to help design select the attributes and their descriptions. And just as an aside, my personal experience has been, I've been on a preference study that probably would have failed had we not have had patient advocacy experts involved in designing the survey. Then the quantitative component. In this case, the decision was to use a discrete choice experiment. And there are about 20 different quantitative methods. In this example, we thought a discrete choice experiment was appropriate, primarily because we wanted to know what levels of changes in those attributes was important to patients. And not every preference method could do that. So another component of the protocol is the sample. Now, it was chosen to be representative of the target population, and we used the patient advocacy group to help fine-tune that. We also thought, in this example, it was very important to verify the diagnosis by patients providing a doctor's note to verify that they have the disease. And sometimes you want this verification to prevent people from jumping into a survey to make money or to be malingering. But other cases, and in this example, the disease was such that patients aren't always sure if they really have that. And by having the doctor's note, you can feel confident that your sample is much more representative of the target population you're looking for. Next slide. So one of the key things from the qualitative work is to get your list of attributes that will go into the quantitative. So we had a short initial list that came from the literature review, and they are potential clinical trial endpoints that may matter to patients, but it's also ones that may be modified by the medical product. And that's a key point. You'll actually hear that a little bit more when I go through the points below. In the qualitative interviews that followed that lit review, so we discovered that patients viewed one of the proposed attributes as unimportant. So we took it out. The patients came up with 3 additional attributes that were of potential importance, but it turned out one of these attributes was just not going to change from the treatment. So even though it might be nice to understand that, you have burden associated with the attributes in the survey, so you don't want to ask things if you don't have to. If your attribute is not going to change with your treatment, with your intervention, there's little value to including it in your preference survey if you really, survey, and you could actually harm your survey by increasing the burden. So the 2 other attributes that the patients thought about were important were added to the preliminary list. We also fleshed out definitions for these attributes that were clear and interpretable to patients. And not shown on the slide, but in the qualitative interviews, we hashed out information relevant to the levels of the attributes to be used so that they would be meaningful to patients and not so close, for example, that patients couldn't differentiate them. Next slide. So armed with the information from the qualitative study, we went back to the protocol. So the attributes were put into the protocol based on the lit search and the qualitative interviews. We included quality checks, and some of the ones we included would be response time. So You heard this before from Laura Lee. If people do a survey very quickly, you potentially have people who are speeding and not paying close attention, potentially, because there are times when it may make sense. And dominated choice tasks, which are ones where one choice is superior in all properties to the other, at least based on our initial assumptions. And we think people who would pick the dominated choice are being illogical, but that is a hypothesis at this point. So, you can't make that the definitive rule. Then we did pre-testing and piloting. For pre-testing, we used the think aloud cognitive interview technique. And what happened in this example is the first time we went through it, we discovered that some things were unclear. We revised the survey overnight. The next day, we did another cognitive think aloud interview. It was better. After a couple of these, we discovered that we weren't needing to change the survey anymore, so it was refined. And then we piloted the program survey, and it worked out fine. The analysis plan was also added, not to the protocol, but to a separate statistical analysis plan, and included the statistical methods to get the relative importance of the attributes and inform the amount of change that you need, that's meaningful to patients. Next slide. Now, all of this was done not just by the researcher alone. They reviewed their plans with the health authorities in the relevant region, and the regulator feedback was incorporated into the protocol. As a personal aside, I've done this, and I found that the feedback from health authorities has been really useful in improving the preference study. It's like getting a outside expert who understands the field but is not invested in the work the same way, and to get their feedback. Next slide. So here are the mock results from this case study. On the left are the 5 efficacy attributes that went into the survey, and the height of the bars reflects the relative importance. And it's clear that attributes 1 and 3 really stood out as being much more important to patients than the others. And then on the right is a reflection of the sizes of changes patients considered meaningful. So these were continuous attributes in measuring probability, going from 0 to 100. And the arrows are showing that the size of a change considered meaningful to a patient for attribute 1 was larger than that for attribute 3. So we won't go into how this is done, but in the discussions with regulators, we took this information and it was used to help support the decision to use endpoints that correspond to attributes 1 and 3. And the meaningful change information was used to help design the effect size for the trial. The preference study was included in the common technical document when the trial was actually submitted later. The preference study results were also shared with the patient advocacy group, not just to be polite, but it really helps take that material and get it out there. And it was published in a peer-reviewed journal. So that's the end of example 1. There's another example in the training materials. Next slide. So I want to emphasize the public comment review is not just for reviewing the guidance, but the training materials as well. You can also suggest for other types of training materials or additional examples. We welcome hearing those comments. Back to you, Francesco.
Thanks a lot, Bennett. Very clear presentation. And personally, I find the illustrative examples extremely useful, and also the FAQs, as you say, they highlight issues that are a little bit more diffuse throughout the guideline, but they're in a format that is really clear question, clear answer. And you've selected and told us about a few of them. Since we're a little bit ahead of time, I'm tempted, Bennett, to ask you about 2 more of these FAQs. One is about the caregiver studies. We often hear about patient preference studies, and the guideline E22 is about patient preference studies, but we also hear sometimes about caregiver studies. Are these addressed in the guideline, and how do they compare to patient preference studies?
Well, formally, they're out of scope of the guideline, but the vast majority of the concepts in the guideline will apply to other stakeholder groups, caregivers, parents, physicians, or even regulators or healthcare health technology experts. There are some important differences that you should think about because they're not in the guidance, but I'll just let you know that the context or the vignette, I mean, are you going to ask a caregiver to give their preferences as if they were the patient or as if they were a caregiver? That's an example of why it's so subtle to include them. And obviously, a physician's preferences are going to differ a lot from those of patients. So it's not trivial to take a survey and apply it to them. But formally, it's out of the scope from the guidance of the guideline. But you really can learn a lot about doing such a survey with those people.
Mhm. So they're clearly not a replacement for patient preference studies, but some of the methodology might apply to both.
Yes, that point is very clear. It's not a replacement. There are times when you simply cannot get a patient's survey, like pediatric cases or diseases that cause dementia, and the best you can do is use somebody else's preferences, but it's not a replacement. It's a different type of information.
And Bennett, I really like the example and your experience on how the patient preference study and the involvement of patients was critical in the design of the study, and also the impact on the clinical trial, which is in one of the examples. And I was wondering, should patient preference studies be conducted within the clinical trial? Is that an option?
It's definitely an option, and there are cases where it is not a bad idea. It may be that your enrollment criteria for a preference study are very difficult. It may require an expensive test, or it may be a very rare type of patient that's hard to find. And you could take advantage of clinical trial machinery to have those patients identified with extremely verified diagnoses. Plus, you have all the auxiliary clinical data that's collected in a rigorous manner during a trial that could be folded into the preference study analysis. However, and we know this from personal experience, putting a preference study into a clinical trial is very difficult. It's time consuming. It can get expensive, and the machinery is not all there. You have to sort of make it up. I could tell you that there are some people who are putting together some publications and on this topic, and you don't want to enter into it willy-nilly, but there are times when it's a good idea.
Thanks a lot, Bennett. Very clear. We will now take a 15 minutes coffee break. Please mute your microphones. The webinar will resume promptly at 15 past the hour. So this is 4:15 p.m. Central European Standard Time. Please join us back for the final session. This is an especially exciting panel featuring patients who will share their perspectives and experiences. Their insights are central to this guideline and will spark a vital discussion, so don't miss it. Back in 15 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good break. We'll resume now with the final, and for me, definitely most important session of today's webinar. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Robin Ben from the US Food and Drug Administration. Robin served as regulatory chair of the E22 working group and has kindly agreed to moderate this discussion. Robin, thank you for joining. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us for this important session. As Dr. Pignati mentioned, my name is Robin Bent and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Today, you've heard that the ICH, or International Council for Harmonization, recently released the ICH E22 Guideline on patient preference studies. Our panelists' insights as patient advocates are really invaluable Today's session is structured into 3 parts: panelists' experiences with patient preference studies, feedback on the ICH E22 guideline, and recommendations for the future. Our panel brings a range of experience and expertise related to how patient perspectives are incorporated into research and development. Some examples may come from direct work on patient preference studies, and others are closely related with work on patient input and patient engagement. I'm joined here today by our 4 esteemed panelists, Francois Houillet, Ashley Valentine, Naomi Sakurai, and Jason Harris. Let me start by asking each one of you to briefly introduce yourself, your name, your organization, and a short description of your background. Jason, let me start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Robin, and thank you, everyone. It's been a great morning here in Washington, D.C. I'm Jason Harris. I lead Vice President for Government Relations and Advocacy at the National Psoriasis Foundation, and have worked for a couple different patient organizations as well. So keep it brief.
Great. Thank you so much. Ashley, maybe I'll turn to you next.
Great. Also, good morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Ashley Valentine. I'm a co-founder and I lead Sick Cells. We're a sickle cell disease advocacy organization. And our experience here with patient preference is that we worked with a manufacturer to field a patient preference study, and we work closely with various community partners to ensure that we are capturing the patient voice. So thank you, everyone. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much, and thank both of you for getting up at the crack of dawn with us and speaking about difficult times to be online. Naomi, let me turn to you and ask you to introduce yourself. I know it's quite late in Japan, so thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. My name is Naomi Sakurai. I was diagnosed with breast cancer in the summer of 2004. When I was in my 30s, it's called AYA generation. Subsequently utilized my personal experience with cancer and my social skill to start up my support group. And nowadays, our federation was established to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the National Cancer Control Act in Japan. It is a national coalition involving the 50 patient groups across Japan, membership exceeding 30,000 people. We have collaborated with several pharmaceutical companies and some of the Japanese research groups to convey the patient perspective. Also, co-creatable reviewers such as lay summaries. So this is a very good opportunity to me share our experience. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And last but certainly not least, Francois, maybe we could turn to you.
Good afternoon from here in Paris, in France. I'm François Houillet. I work for the European Organization for Rare Diseases, or ORDIS, which is a large network of more than 1,000 member organizations in 77 countries, so beyond the EU. I joined ORDIS in 2003, and before this, since the 90s, I was a patient advocate for HIV and AIDS.
Wonderful, thank you. So as everyone can tell, we have a great panel of people with a lot of experience and expertise. Let me start off by asking everyone the same question, and I'm framing it somewhat broadly, about what has your experience or interest in patient preference studies been? Maybe you can briefly describe how you've been involved, for example, whether it's educating members, contributing to study planning, or things like that. And Francois, since you just spoke, maybe we'll start this one with you.
Thank you, Robin. First, I think about the need for such studies and their importance, and before even the name of such patient preference studies even existed. And I was in a meeting with 35 other patient advocates from all over the world, discussing with a pharmaceutical company right after they had decided the dose for the phase 3 trial for a new HIV product. And they had decided the dose together with clinicians. And we looked at all the data, and there was a grade 2 event that caught our attention, the maximum tolerated dose had not been reached. So the proposal in the phase 3 was to use even higher doses. But this grade 2 event was for us far too frequent, and it consisted in loose stools, which we did not clearly know what it was. But then we had for 2 hours a fascinating discussion on which dose related to the potential efficacy the patient advocates would prefer. And we convinced the company to change the dose they had decided for the phase 3. So we could discuss not only our preference regarding the objective of the research, was it to eradicate the virus, or was it for patients to be able to take a medicine for long periods of time and control the replication, but also the preference vis-a-vis the dose. And that was so important to have this discussion that we thought every time an important decision like this one is made during the development of a medicine, it is essential to capture the preference of the patients one way or the other. By that time, it was a meeting. But here, the beauty of patient preference studies is that they provide a structure and rigorous method to capture these preferences for all sorts of reasons. And to make a long story short, I was then involved in the design of such studies for Duchenne muscular dystrophy with the University of Leuven, or for rare cancers, particularly emphasizing how the findings and the results can be interpreted and discussed with patients and together with regulators. Thank you.
Thank you. Naomi, would you mind sharing some of your experiences?
Oh. So we have also the drafting the study protocol or analyzing the result. But I want to touch about educating with our members and the researchers. So we collaborated with some academic scientists on several workshops as a unique activity. The Japanese Society of Clinical Oncology holds an annual workshop where the patient and caregivers and researchers, especially young researchers, and exchange opinion on considering the side effects and other topics based on the sample of clinical trials protocol. This workshop is highly popular with both patients and young researchers. For researchers, it provides a learning opportunity, understanding patient fears and terms that may be difficult to understand. And also for patients, it helps them finding diversity by learning about the various experiences, perspectives, and preferences of other patients beyond their personal diseases and journey. That is very good education system, I believe it.
Yes, no, I think that that's really important, and you're highlighting the importance of really patient engagement and patient involvement throughout the medical product development, both at the patient preference level, but really throughout medical product development. I think that's key, really a key concept. Yes. Jason, let me turn to you.
Sure. So I think for the National Psoriasis Foundation, really, I think our work really spans sort of the full life cycle. So, Naomi just was talking about drafting protocols, and Naomi, I love the part of the research program is that the two-way learning, right, with researchers and individuals from communities. I think that should be highlighted as really important. And then we help to recruit for studies. I probably have a little bit more experience educating our community, right? Bring them together. What is this? Why is it important? All those kind of reasons. And then we've also, co-author manuscripts and the like. So the one study I think I'd highlight as a somewhat recent example is a global study working with a group called the International Psoriasis Council, and the NPF partnered to take a look at preferences on disease severity and found some really interesting data in terms of like what people in our community think is severe versus maybe how some of those things are measured in trials and such. So I'll kick it to Ashley.
Yes. Go ahead,
Great,
Ashley.
thank you. Great, thank you. So our experience at Six Cells, we're really here, I think, serving as a case study. So we participated in one patient preference study with a manufacturer, and from start to finish, we were involved in the process. And what we were really careful about was considering social determinants of health and trying to mitigate those so that we can ensure that there was open access across the sickle cell community, and also ensure that we are capturing the broader sickle cell disease voice in the patient preference study. What I mean about that is oftentimes individuals that engage in research are ones that know about the research. So they're checking their emails, they have daytime availabilities. And so what we were really careful to do was make sure that we were mitigating things like the digital divide, or making sure that we were educating the sickle cell community about how to even participate in a patient preference study so that they were able to fully engage in the process. And we were fortunate to work with a manufacturer that sort of believed in us and trusted our process. So at the very beginning, even before we fielded the study, we weighed in on the complications that were talked about with sickle cell, the language used, and even in that piece, we were really careful to have testers that had a variety of backgrounds. So some testers had master's degrees with sickle cell, some had associate degrees, some had high school degrees. We had one tester whose second language was English. So all of that matters because that's representative of the broader community. And then in terms of recruitment, we used a hub and spoke model. So we trained the trainer. We worked with community-based organizations that had existing CHWs, community health workers. And then we were able to field the survey across the entire United States, being very careful to select different regions. So we were getting a variety of regional differences in the sample size. And then finally, we produced a lay summary so that the participants could understand how their research was being used. And then we also wrote an academic summary or academic paper based off of this research as well.
Great, thank you. And I think we're going to dig down into some of your different experiences with all of those topics as we move forward, because I think you have a lot of learnings, and from our conversations, I've felt like these are things that if we were doing research without engaging with the community, just wouldn't have a clue of where to start or how to do this correctly. So I think we're going to spend a little bit more time digging down into that in a few minutes. And in fact, our next question really is to get into a little bit more detail around community engagement and how patient preference studies kind of connect back to patient communities. And so for this question, I'd like to maybe ask you a little bit about how you all have talked to your communities about patient preference studies. What was their reaction, and what channels you have used, and kind of what feedback you've received from your community. And so let me start with Jason, and then I'll go to Ashley, and then to Naomi.
Yeah. Well, I think what's worked well, I think for us, has been having that constant communication, being able to report back on findings as soon as we can. But also, I think, as everyone sort of alluded to, getting together from the outset and trying to understand what is the real purpose, right, of why we're all here today to move forward. And I think identifying that and communicating it really clearly, if it's something that is, whether it's the risk benefit is interesting to our community, right, then it makes it a lot easier for them to sort of be excited to participate in those things. So I think for us, it's always talking about the why, in terms of like, why do we think this is important to do? Why do we want you to join us? And I think the last thing I'll say is just those little tips and feedback you get when you're talking to folks around, this was a little bit longer, last week, or, would really like to be able to, in some cases, maybe previous to some of our technology, right? Like being able to save your answers, even one for us, which like we hadn't even thought about like 5 or 6 years ago, to be honest. And so those have been some pretty interesting ones for us.
Thanks, Jason. Ashley, I know you spoke a little bit, a good amount about the patient and community engagement, but is there anything that you want to go a little bit deeper into and to discuss a little bit more?
Sure. So community engagement and making sure that the community felt valued were probably the biggest pieces why this was successful. And tangibly how we did that was really looking at who the messenger was and what the message is. So even before fielding the survey, we made sure that the language was the language that the community uses, that the complications were aligned with what the community experiences. And then secondly, the messenger is really important. So working with community health workers, that was the first barrier to getting participants to understand and even want to participate. So the community health workers already have that rapport. They already know where their patients are. They already know how to talk to the community members. And so what we did was we trained and empowered the CHWs to understand patient preference. We even worked with the manufacturer to create a training video. And so the CHWs understood exactly what they were doing. And then we left it up to the CHWs, the community health workers, to meet with their constituents. So what that allowed was that the people taking the patient preference study felt comfortable and confident that they could do this study. They were more willing to be honest in their responses because they were speaking with someone that they know. And they were more willing to engage and complete the survey start to finish, because some of these are pretty long. So having someone on the phone fielding a survey with them was really helpful. And then what it also did was accommodate for individuals who, weren't feeling well that day, or who didn't really know how to use a computer, or whose language skills were a little bit lower because the survey was being read to them. And then what we did was we asked the CHWs, we surveyed them afterwards, just, a little opinion, how they felt the patient preference study went. And it was glowing responses. They were really motivated. So one of the quotes I'll say is that the survey presented us with an opportunity to connect with our community. So the CHWs, it gave them something different to talk to their constituents about. Talking about their complications, it's not usually what they do. So it opened up a different avenue for communication. So overall, it was really well received.
Great, thank you. Naomi, do you have thoughts about the community engagement?
Yeah, I have, but I had another comment. So it is very grateful activity. So I can find it. We will work together to determine what materials you can understand and we can understand. This involves setting up a question like what side effect you want to avoid, or what you like to ask. Or we may also convert things into simple language, or sometimes comic. Don't you know that Japan loves to manga culture. So we change it to the manga or some of the comic. However, at present, there are still few cases where we can participate from the more early stages. That is very good things for us. That's all. Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you. And I think those are really good points, right? You're asking questions that matter to patients, and you're asking questions that are using the language that the patients use to describe that. And I think I know you and Ashley and Jason all kind of touched on that. Francois, did you have anything you wanted to add for this question?
Regarding the engagement, yeah, I think in rare diseases in particular, where the diseases are often poorly described, patients really understand immediately how important it is to complete and to inform the developers, but also the regulators on what matters for the development of new medicines. One example, for example, the patients with spinal muscular atrophy, they were describing how the disease can affect patients, and different patients may describe different ways the disease can affect their daily life. And the list was so long, they wanted to capture of all the possible symptoms or ways the disease can affect your life. What are the three most important ones that maybe a new medicine can help improve? So they did their own preference study among 837 patients. And clearly, the three most important aspects were the possibility to go to the restroom by himself or herself, followed by tolerating himself or herself, and followed by turning in bed with no help. And from there, they could search if there is an existing patient-reported outcome measure that could document on the desired effect. And there are so many situations where patient communities can understand how they can contribute, informing either the developer or the regulators. So often as a double check that we need really to explain the potential, the importance these studies might have to help interpret the results from clinical trials or contextualize the importance of primary endpoints or secondary endpoints to document on what it means for the patients. And I think the full spectrum from defining the unmet needs to describing what matters to patients, but also to quantify to which extent it matters to patients, can help engage the patient communities in all phases of these studies.
That is really, really an excellent point. I think historically we've thought of patient preference studies only really kind of quantifying that benefit risk or focusing mostly on quantifying that benefit risk trade-offs. But everybody here has kind of brought up the importance of other types of preference studies where they can inform endpoint selection or other really key important factors throughout the drug development. And so thank you for that. Now I'm going to turn to a question about motivation. And obviously everybody here and all of our patients are, motivated to help kind of understand. But let's talk more specifically about motivation, because we need to be pragmatic, right? And it's asking people to volunteer a huge amount of time is asking a lot of people. So let's talk a little bit about what motivates organizations and patients to participate in a patient preference study. And Ashley, I'm going to start with you, because I feel like in our prior conversations, this has been a really, really important thing to discuss. So why don't we start with Ashley? I'll go to Jason, Francois, and then Naomi.
Sure. So apart from, I think the top motivator was having that familiarity, right? So the rapport, but then also I think for us, the second top was fair compensation. So we were able to draft a budget where the CBOs, the partnering CBOs, they also received fair compensation because they were building this into an existing workflow for the community health workers. And then for
Can you tell me what a CBO is? I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm throwing acronyms around. So a CBO is a community-based organization. So sometimes it's a patient advisory group. But what they are is each state has a sickle cell organization that issues direct services. So that's helping the families pay for medication, because sometimes insurance in the United States is in a way where you do have to pay out of pocket, or it's helping families find childcare or learn about sickle cell disease. So those community-based organizations are rooted locally in a community, which then means they have more access because they're helping their neighbors and their teachers and things like that.
Thanks.
Great. And so what we did was we offered compensation to the community-based organizations because they were using their employees, community health workers, to field this survey. And then what we also did was we offered honorariums or compensation to the survey participants, because some of them were taking an hour and a half, 2 hours out of their workday to participate in this study. And so we were really showing that we valued their opinion and that they were helping to advance research. And I wouldn't say that was the main driving force, because a lot of people in our community is really altruistic. They really want to help their loved one with sickle cell, or their person with sickle cell. They want to help. But it really was a strong motivator to offer an honorarium, given that they were going to be giving this much of their time to something like a patient preference study.
Great, thank you. And I think that is really, really a key point. Jason, let me turn to you.
Yeah, I'll reiterate. I think the compensation piece is definitely something we found is big if you can get it in the budget, and we certainly try to do, whether it's honestly like an annual survey or things like that. We try to have some form of compensation because we know we're asking folks to do things. And kind of like my previous point, I would say our community, once we have that education done and sort of like a clarity around how your preferences might influence outcomes down the line, right? Whether that's benefit risk, clinical trial design, that is such a key piece to bringing people in. And then, you know, the other, I guess, kind of obvious ones, maybe this isn't really helpful one is just having a very clear timeline, communicating well, communicating back to folks. But then also, I always think of like the technology, like the ease of how to complete something, whether that's over the phone, whether it's going to be on your computer, right? Like those are, you know, obviously critical pieces that everything we can do to make it easier, we know folks will be more likely to hold on with us.
Great, thank you. Francois.
Yeah, I haven't come to discussions where compensation would be an issue yet. I think this might differ if you discuss with potential participants who are members of a patient group or not. There may be different motivations, and particularly if the study is taking time, that probably compensation may become important. Important, but maybe secondary compared to the importance of the research question. I think people immediately are motivated to participate to these studies when they understand how important the question is and the response are. For example, we had one of these studies for a medicine for multiple sclerosis, which had been suspended from the market, and the regulators requested a study among patients to see how patients themselves weighted the new the information on the new risks that had emerged versus the potential benefit. And they conducted the study, and then the regulators reintroduced the study. So when the question is so important for the patient community, I think the motivation is natural. And also the motivation to solve what we call the loneliness of the patient advocates involved, for example, in regulatory decision making. When you come alone in a meeting as an expert and you are confronted with very difficult questions, do you think patients would be willing to take the risk of suffering from this side effect? With patient preference studies, you're not alone anymore. You have the voice, the views of many more patients who responded to the study. And this, I think the participants understand the importance of this aspect.
Thank you. Thank you. And Naomi.
Yeah, the answer is very simple. So we want to create a high quality clinical research and trials together. There is often a disconnected between the research finding and our lived experiences. So this is because many studies prioritize the OS, overall survival, and evaluate the efficacy based on it. So we know it is important, but on the other side, patients are also people live their own life. So patients often traded side effects and time toxicity, so such as the visit times and the time of the hospital stays. So as a patient advocate, we want all patients can receive or choose the treatment with true understanding and satisfaction. So this is very important things for our motivated.
Right. So as I think what we're hearing here, and I think it's very clear that there are multiple motivations. There's the altruistic motivations. There's the desire to really have your preferences kind of considered and weighed in decision making. And then, but there is an important component of ensuring that we're not asking patients to just continuously volunteer their time for this activity, if we want to make sure that we are able to reach all of the or many of the patients that we want to hear from, because this can, you know, add a cost to people, whether it's taking time off from work or taking time away from their families and things like that. So thank you. I think that was a really really great discussion about your experiences. I'd like to kind of pivot now and move on to a little bit more of the feedback in the ICH E22 guideline. And so really going to focus initially on a question about patient input into study development. The guideline emphasizes patient input throughout PPS development, from design and attribute selection to analysis. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about how critical you all think this involvement is, what that could look like, and what potential barriers there might be to some of this involvement. And maybe for this one, I'll start with Francois, and then Naomi, Ashley, and then Jason.
Well, first, these guidelines are extremely useful because, as explained, there are many different techniques, qualitative or quantitative. And often when you start discussing patient preference studies, you immediately are overwhelmed by many technical discussions. And really starting from the principles and having clear ideas on how to get started and the important principles to have in mind, it really helps structure the brains when designing and conducting these studies. The importance, and different people said it, of involving patients from the design phase, even in the discussion whether such a study would be needed and which questions themselves might have for a patient preference study, or discuss the question that the developer or regulators might have. These are fascinating discussions. The difficulties are sometimes related to when to start planning the study, at what point of the development, particularly if it is during the evaluation of the benefit risk itself. The timelines are very short, so it may not be the best moment to request such a study. So how can we anticipate at which point of the development and scientific advice can we discuss if such studies can be envisaged? I think that will continue to be challenging anyway. Plus, in terms of conduct, the main questions we'll have, at least in rare diseases, how many patients exactly do we need? What about the heterogeneity? We saw, for example, for multiple sclerosis, which is not a rare disease, but depending the study was conducted in one country, the UK, or in another one, Poland, you would obtain totally opposite preferences from patients. So how do decision makers decide? That we need a more global decision, but we know there are important variations in different cultures, in different countries. I think the representativeness and the generalizability of the results will be important issues to describe, to discuss, but definitely to involve patients, at least to make sure the attributes are well described. It's one thing to use, for example, the MedDRA preferred term. They're not always self-explanatory. And unless, as a patient, a potential treated patient, you really have a clear idea of the side effect or of the benefit, using the descriptions that other patients have prepared or reviewed will help understand the attribute and decide which level you would prefer. So to make sure that not only the information is understood, but is meaningful to those requested to respond is key for the success of the study.
Great, thank you. And I think we did try to address some of those things within the guideline, particularly the thinking about this early and starting early, because we know how difficult it is to plan anything at the last minute and develop something of high quality. So thank you for that. I think I said, and I apologize because I didn't write it down, I think I said I was going to go to Naomi next. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah, so I heard this story from a patient with rare and incurable diseases. So when a new drug was developed and it's evaluated focus on the kidney function only kidney functions. So they understand that the kidney function is a highly important medical indicator. But for incurable disease patient, they want to evaluate it more wide scope, not just only one organ. So I found that is very understandable reason they progress this patient path preferences study. But furthermore, this is a problem when it happened in Japan. Actually, the quality of patient preference studies primarily conducted by the pharmaceutical companies and marketing departments. So sometimes lacks the integrity. So the questionnaire manufactured a bill chantry and reports are compromised while ignore the patient voice. Sometimes it happens. And the quality of moderator is also an issue, since moderators are often contracted through the advertising companies connected to the pharmaceutical companies. They can sometimes lead discussion in a biased way. So before this meeting, I spoke with several disease groups and everyone expressed the same complaints and concerns how to progress this patient preference study. The moderator is very important.
Yes, no, I think that's a really good point, and I think the guideline tries to focus a little bit on the importance of that that qualitative work and the moderator's guide and factors like that, so that we really truly understand what matters to patients. So thank you for bringing that up. Jason, did I say I was coming to you next?
Actually, Ashley was next.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Ashley.
No, that's okay. So I would say, thinking about the guidelines, one, having a guideline is a very, very strong start. And it does show that there is a guidance or a recommendation that you work with patients. I do think, much like Naomi was saying, here as well in the United States, majority of the entities that do patient preference studies are manufacturers. Some of the challenge is going to be getting the buy-in of how important it is to work with patients and patient groups. Why I raise that is because it is quite a bit of work working with patient groups, and it does mean that your timeline will slow, because you do have to take into account that you're working with community organizations. And if you truly are wanting to capture accurate data, you do have to account that you're working with people who have chronic diseases. So something that we even flag is extend the timeline, because for sickle cell, the weather impacts when people are in the hospital. So if you want to field a study during winter or when school starts, you just have to account for the fact that a lot of your participants are going to be sick. So they're going to have to cancel, they're going to have to reschedule. That's just what it is, but it will slow down the timeline. Or if you're doing things like training community health workers how to speak to participants about a patient preference study and all of these little steps that are very important if you want to get accurate information, it's very time consuming as well. So it's not particularly a challenge with the guidelines. It's more of a challenge with buy-in and implementing the guidelines, and then also understanding that you have to work with a patient group, because a guideline is just a guideline. You have to tailor that guideline to the population you're studying. And as I just said, that takes investment and it takes a lot of time, but everybody wins when you invest from the start in working with patients and making sure that you have a strong patient preference from the beginning.
Great, and I think that both you and Francois have mentioned that the importance of ensuring that you're planning early, and so that you have that opportunity to ensure that you do get that really rich and valuable information. All right, Jason.
Yeah, well, and even just building on everything Ashley just mentioned in terms of understanding the community, right, and knowing and working with an organization like Ashley's, if that's the case, to understand like what does this look like in practice, so we can not make that mistake. And I feel like that goes right into it. I think I was really excited to read through, a really good section in the guideline on the cognitive challenges. I'm blanking on that name, sorry. But like that happens in our community so much, right? It's like, I just had to answer this question about how, challenging it was to be off treatment or not be able to get it or all those things. And so it really does take a toll on folks. And I think we consistently do hear that because, think about representativeness. The other thing is, as I think as everyone on this panel has said, to be able to get to everyone you need to that makes a representative are probably not the first huge chunk that are responding to your initial email. And so one thing I threw out there, and I'm sure Robin and you're already thinking it and have thought it, and many others, but like we love examples. So like more concrete examples as things progress on how representativeness was maybe met, in a way that obviously doesn't hamstring anyone. I think those, Ashley's example from that study is amazing, right, and something to hold on to. But I think continuing to maybe provide some of those examples for folks will be very helpful because it can be done, just needs to be thought about, planned, and then executed.
Yeah, and thank you, because that segues us right into our next question about representative participation. And so E22 discusses the importance of ensuring study participants represent the actual patient population who will use this treatment. Are there challenges that you see in achieving this, and what specific concerns do you have maybe about underrepresented patient groups? And then finally, maybe if you want to speak to, since this is an international guideline, if you think the guideline covers these issues adequately. And Ashley, I'm going to start with you because I think you gave us during our prep calls, you gave us a kind of an example about different regions and things. And I think typically when we think about representativeness, we think about a lot of things, but maybe not that. But obviously your group and having that expertise with your patient population can surface these things that we might not think about from a clinical perspective. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure, absolutely. So I stated at the beginning, I'm from the United States. And for anyone who doesn't know, the United States is a very large country, and each state has their own health insurance if you're using the government health insurance. And each state also, many states have different climates, and there's 4 different time zones here. And it's cold in one state and it's warm in another state. The education system is different in one state. So all of these things play into access to care. Some states offer paid leave if you have a child, some states don't. And so something we really thought about were regional differences in terms of access and what it's like to have the same disease but live in a different part of the United States, where your access to a specialist is going to look different. Your access to health insurance is going to change what medications you can even have, and it also is going to impact how you take care of your complications. So really tangibly thinking about this, we worked with 5 different community-based organizations, and we did that specifically because we worked in states that had high prevalence of sickle cell, and we also worked in a few states that had a very small amount of sickle cell patients. And it's a little counterintuitive. Some of the states that had very, very small populations of people living with sickle cell, those patients actually received better care because there were less of them. So if we bring that back to a guideline or global setting, sort of thinking about just outside the clinic, those are called social determinants of health here. How do the social determinants of health impact how a participant is going to be in a survey, how they're going to live with their disease, what complications impact their lives more? And then the other regional difference brought in languages. So we included some states that have a high amount of Spanish speakers. A barrier that we had is that we only offered the study in English and just light Spanish, but that meant anyone else that didn't speak English or enough English to participate with a light translator meant that they couldn't participate in this study. So all of that plays into thinking about capturing a representation of the community who would benefit from a therapy.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to Francois, then Naomi, then Jason, and I'll remember this time. Francois?
I think it's important to first adapt the tools for the studies to different types of patients. Jason said it, there is the issue of cognitive impairment, which can vary from one patient to the next. And we are extremely interested to see efforts to conduct studies among patients with recent Alzheimer's disease, for example. I think it's a useful effort. You never should say, oh, that's impossible to question people with this condition. I think there are ways to explore, which need more time always, but I think they're worth. Plus, to use maybe different formats for the same patient population, because we know different people might prefer different methods. Some are perfectly okay with an online questionnaire. Others would prefer a telephone interview, even with an AI robot, but others may prefer a paper printed type of form, which is very difficult for discrete choice experiment, but why not try it? I think we shouldn't decide of a format that would fit all patients. But plus the language, we were discussing, for example, about a registry that would cover all of Germany, which is a large member state. To cover 95% of the population, they would need 8 different languages. And often we forget some ethnic minorities or language minorities in countries, but we shouldn't forget them. Otherwise, we will systematically exclude patients with different languages. And these studies are so sophisticated that they need to be conducted in the language that is the most comfortable to the person. But I think even with the best efforts, the sample size will always be a difficulty, particularly in rare diseases. We know there are differences and heterogeneity between different patients, different groups, different subgroups. That's why I think it depends on the precision and on the questions.
Thank you. I think those are some really, really good points, and hopefully the encouragement of the guideline to think about this will help pre-plan and help to mitigate this. Naomi, I think you had some thoughts maybe about specific regional or population-based challenges that you thought were important to highlight. Do you want to share those with us?
Yeah, I'd like to share one successful story. So we evaluated the supportive care for terminal illness cancer patient. So usually the endpoint focus on the muscle volume and the grip strength. But we understand that those functions are indicated of general physician condition. But however, at the request of the patient and caregivers, we discuss adding the assessment like I felt appetite or I enjoying eating with family. These become the secondary endpoints. And finally, this clinical trial was a success. So supportive care is very important treatment, but setting the endpoint is very difficult. So we hope the patient preference studies will progress furthermore fast for such therapies and medical devices. And also, we know it is very different barrier, language and ages and disease area and culture and values. But this guideline is progress of a challenge. I believe it.
Yes, no, I think we're making progress, and hopefully we will be able to, when it's appropriate, include patient preference studies. All right, and Jason, let me wrap this question up with you, if you have anything else to add.
I feel like I jumped ahead, so I think one thing I'd say is, with the purpose of the guideline looking to be international, right? A lot of different potential designs. I think it feels like there's the flexibility makes sense, right, in terms of how that's drawn out, and kind of similar to how the agency in the States has taken a look at some of this too. So.
Great, thank you. And I think we're going to move to our final kind of specific question before moving on to like your feedback on the overall guideline. And so our final specific question is really about, really focuses on participant burden. The guideline discusses multiple potential uses for patient preference studies, and sometimes studies try to answer several questions at once. What are your thoughts on the burden on participants of kind of trying to do a larger, more comprehensive study versus maybe different smaller studies if necessary? Maybe we can talk a little bit about that and about survey fatigue and cognitive burden. And let me start with Francois, and then Jason, Ashley, and then Naomi.
I think we need to be aware and conscious of the dropout rates, and when participants have agreed to take part in such studies, it's really key that they understand where the questions are leading them or us all. I think that the risk that they would quit, that they would abandon the questionnaire while responding questions is high if they're asking themselves, but where is this leading us? Well, I thought I had understood that the questions were going in this direction, but now they're asking me to compare to another product. I thought we were measuring which kind of benefit would compensate for different levels of these side effects, and now they're asking me to compare with product B or D. So when they are lost themselves within the questionnaire, I think this is where we risk the higher dropout rate. So personally, I tend to think that when there are multiple questions, we need multiple studies, including maybe in different patients, depending on their availability, rather than designing studies aiming at responding to many different questions at the same time, where people would be lost en route, and then we wouldn't have the number of responses or complete responses that we need.
Great, thank you. Jason?
Yeah, I think just earlier this week, we were having this battle where we basically were trying to have two objectives in a qualitative study that we just put out, and we took the second one, which was less important, out because as we were reviewing it and talking to folks in our community, it just didn't work. So I totally agree there. Like it needs to be really relevant to someone's real world impact. I think if you want to go, like, they got to kind of hit all of those, I think, for some of that motivation. And then just, I know we talked about burden before too, but I think of our community folks, are probably living with an additional chronic disease as well, right? So you just start to like get into the actual, like, what does a day look like, and trying to be really thoughtful about when to try and kind of go for that. And so I think that, the longer studies to me just have to be really clear with, easy to understand, like almost to another degree, if that's the way, because I do think the dropout gets pretty tough. I think we've seen that, we have like an annual survey that's like a lot of questions, and it gets filled out, but it's, it's a battle each year. So.
Yeah, so it sounds like being pretty clear, and also maybe providing an accurate estimate to people of how long you anticipate this filling out the survey might actually take is particularly helpful.
Yeah, and sharing the results back. I'll just keep saying that. Like we cannot ask people to do things and then just forget about them and just say, oh, well, it's done. Like, people really want to know, okay, what impact did I have? And I think that's really what this whole area comes down to.
Great, thank you. I think that's a critical point. Ashley?
Sure. The group is really highlighting that to have a focus study is the most important. So the timing is going to vary. I think the one we did was 90 minutes. But something just to reiterate is, you're asking people to relive complications of their disease. So I'm sure in many diseases, PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorders exist. So if you are asking someone what complication or what endpoint are you willing to live with, often that will trigger an event where they're having to relive that moment. So that's something to really take into consideration. So if you have a focus study and you sort of limit the amount of time you're requesting from people, you can reduce some of the emotional burden of this. You can't reduce it completely, and that's something to be transparent about upfront. So offer disclaimers, what you'll be talking about, again, reiterating what this group has already said, giving them a, we'll have you on for 90 minutes, being really clear about the expectations, and then being expeditious about publishing the results. Because if you're asking people to relive some of these complications, or you're asking caregivers to have to talk about times they were really scared or very worried that their person wasn't going to live, you then have to make it worth it. So we talk about compensation, but also really putting forth the research to show that they're helping to change treatment options for the population. So a focus study length of time is really important. And then this is another benefit of working with community health workers. So if you're sitting alone in your own head doing a patient preference study, then you're just reliving that isolated. But if you're working with a community health worker, you're taking this survey with someone else, that moderator, like Naomi was saying, or the community health worker, they're able to sort of spot when the person is triggered, or if you need to stop the survey, or taking space so that you can really get through the study. So all of that matters when thinking about focus and length of time.
Thanks. And I think what you just said really brought to mind something that I really try to encourage people to do, which is really to publish those results, both because people deserve to see those results, but also because then maybe you're not having people repeat the same studies over and over and over again. Maybe you can find that information that's already out there, and you don't have to burden people with asking the same questions to the same population repeatedly. And I know Dr. Levitin talked about that, I think, and others talked about that a little bit earlier, looking to see if that study already exists, if you can build off of it, or if you need to do a de novo study. Naomi, let me turn to you for your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so that is, we call it time toxicity. So we always answer that. A lot of questions is coming. Oh my gosh, it's reached to the 40 minutes. So please ask her is it good or not good? Before do it, ask the patient advocate or groups, and improve the tool or the questionnaire. And next time, try to it next time. And also the feedback is very important. So this is a new challenge. I believe it is a new challenge. So please continue the dialogue with each other.
Yes, no, thank you. I think that is key, really. The communication, I think, is what we're hearing, two-way conversation about this. All right, so now let's pivot to overall guideline feedback, stepping back from kind of the individual sections of the guideline. What is your overall reaction to the ICH E22 guideline? Are there areas that you think are particularly strong? Are there areas that concern you? And are there areas where there's gaps? And so maybe let me start with Jason, and then Naomi, Ashley, and then Francois.
Absolutely. So I mean, huge kudos to everyone involved in putting this together. I think it's really good. And, at the end of the day, how we see it at the MPF is, like the baseline is, our behaviors or things going to change, right? And I think this guideline gives everyone that ability to advance this field and this science forward. And then, of course, it just comes down to the execution, which Francois, Ashley, and Naomi have all sort of mentioned in terms of the implementation is going to be key. How people go about it, right? All those learnings, which probably can't be spelled out too much in terms of some of that. So I think it's in a really good place. I'll repeat sort of the thing I said, I think as this work continuing to gather those examples, highlight, really novel or interesting ways that we've seen groups go about it, will only help everyone and move this forward. So thank you.
Thank you. Naomi? Oh, Naomi, I think you're muted. I can't hear you. I can see you speaking, but maybe it looks like maybe it's a mute on your speaker. Nope, we still can't hear you. While you work on that, I'm going to turn to Ashley, and we'll come back.
Yep,
Good.
great. Overall, just high level, I would say having a guideline is really strong. So drug development is probably one of the only piece of the healthcare spectrum that has a guideline that highlights patient preference and the importance of patient engagement, and then also the benefit both clinically and economically about incorporating patient feedback. So, I mean, we work with insurance companies in the US, we work with hospital systems, we even work with providers. And I mean, outside of nursing, there's not really a piece of the healthcare spectrum here that really emphasizes the importance and how it's a good investment to include patient preference, or include patient input in studies and research like this. So it levels the playing field. So I think that's really important. The challenge, like I said earlier, is just going to be buy-in, and then also making sure that the patient organizations also understand how to engage with industry or whomever is conducting the studies. So having the guideline is a really strong start. It's just going to be implementing and tailoring it for each disease state. That'll be the challenge.
Great, thank you. Naomi, let's.
Yeah, maybe.
Yes, we can
maybe
hear
I
you.
come
Perfect.
back. Thank you very much. So it's my comment message. I truly believe that creating this guideline was a very big challenge. Very, very big challenges. So every country has a different culture and healthcare system and regulations, especially regulation is different. For instance, how about including a statement on the opening page and expressing the why should we start this new challenge and creating these guidelines? So why times may changing, but philosophy is still remain in and it continues universal. So I think such an approach could be worthwhile. So I believe that so in the United States or some European country and Japan, this time the three major regulations that join and create this guidelines. So please load to the first page or opening page in your voice, from your voice.
It's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Francois.
Thank you.
The good surprise when I first read the guidelines is how short they are. I must say I was afraid that they would be much more comprehensive than that, but in fact they are so concise, clear, and to the point, and that's how they are the most useful. Because once all aspects of these guidelines are covered, I think it helps those willing to conduct these studies to then work on the rest. One aspect maybe which is missing is some patient preference studies, particularly those designed to inform or guide the developer at an early stage, maybe can be adapted, reused, some attributes can be removed, others can be added when it comes to the evaluation of the benefit risks, rather than starting to redesign a new patient preference study from zero again. And I don't think there is much on the possibility to develop a patient preference study and use it or adapt it for a later stage for a different use by different decision makers. I think maybe some paragraph on, I don't know how possible that is, but maybe that could be interesting, not to give the idea that every time at different steps, the company would have to invest in something completely new. If part of the study can be reused and adapted, I think that would be nice to know. We also have concerns about patient preference studies which have been conducted. What if the data, the results are not submitted? That's a risk situation we see could happen. For example, if a company thinks that the results are not in favor of their product, and finally they decide not to submit the findings, then maybe we need to be clear that as for clinical trials, once these studies have been done, they should be published or submitted. At some point, we thought whether a different version would be needed for patient organizations, because we hear sometimes patient organizations, oh, it's about patient preferences, we can conduct surveys, we can do it by ourselves. I think the message in these guidelines is that these studies are only useful if rigor applies from beginning to the end. This is a scientific research, and calling for partnerships between patients, industry, and academia is certainly the way forward. And in fact, listening to the presentation today, plus the training materials and annexes, I think the guidelines are also an excellent tool, even if the primary target is industry, an excellent tool to explain to patient organizations the potential these studies have, but what it means to embark in these studies and really helping them to understand how to partner with a pharmaceutical company or an academia or both, if they are willing to conduct or propose such studies themselves.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a really well thought through and very comprehensive response with a lot of really good actionable ideas from all of you. So really appreciate that. And so let's move on to our final question of the day, kind of our wrapping it up. And I have a question about one key recommendation you'd give to researchers designing patient preference studies, or if you prefer, the biggest opportunity for patient preference studies to better serve patients and improve drug development. So as we wrap up, again, let me start with Naomi, Jason, Ashley, and then Francois. And what is one key recommendation you'd give to researchers designing patient preference studies, or one a big opportunity for patient preference studies? Naomi?
So I think this guideline is focused on the not only disease, it's a patient or person-centered. So I really love to this guidelines. But additionally, I think so Robin, do you load the opening page from your voice and sending your energy and meaning these studies? I want to read it. This is a guideline, so it is not without such emotional things. But I believe so the energy and philosophy is very important things. Please load it on the opening page.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that recommendation. I think really what is key to this is the understanding that the patient perspective is very, very critical. Drug development and patient preference studies are one way of better understanding the patient perspective. Thank you. Jason?
I think my recommendation would be when we've seen this done well, and I guess I'll say done right. I'm a lobbyist in DC, so like I can just be confident about what I say. I think that it speeds the process up. I would say. I think like you get ahead of potential hurdles and things like that, and we've certainly heard that. But I think sometimes I could see how some of this work gets into like, well, it's going to slow me down and all that. But I think if we take a little bit longer term look at it, you're going to save more time in the end once this gets going. So that would be my advice.
Thank you. And I think we talk a lot about that with patient-focused drug development, that the setup it might delay the first patient in, but it could also has the benefit of speeding up the first patient out of the trial, right? If you get it right and you don't have to do multiple amendments and things like that. So I think planning for this has real potential for downstream benefits. Thank you. Ashley.
Sure. So I would say trusting the process would be the key takeaway, and being open to different types of research methods. So what we typically see in patient preference is that the researchers are coming from medical backgrounds, or they're economists or PhDs. But what really made this study successful is that we use sort of ethnographical research methods or anthropological research methods. We used mixed methods. We sort of went beyond qualitative, and we even wove in some elementary education teaching practices. So that might be a little uncomfortable when thinking about endpoints, because that's really clinical focus or really quantitative, but really having the researchers take the guidelines and then be open to these other types of methods that might be proven to work in marketing or education in those other areas, but let them be applied to this type of study. That's what really made our work successful, is that the manufacturer trusted the value in giving us the freedom to use whatever type of research methods we found most beneficial to the community we were in.
Thanks. And I think that's why we ended up with a general principles kind of high level document, because we understand that this is evolving. The science is evolving, the experiences are evolving. And I think that the goal was to ensure that this guideline would have staying power as everything evolves. So that's a really good point. And so, all right, Francois, let me turn to you for the last word.
So maybe a message to clinicians, to researchers in industry, in academia, and even to regulators: never assume you know what patients would prefer before you ask them. I think it's a wise point to start from. We made a very interesting experiment, dividing the room at the EMA, clinicians in one room and patients in the other room, and they were discussing medicine with a risk of sudden death for a rare cancer in the elderly. For the clinicians, it was a no way. They would not expose their patients to sudden death, but the patients had a completely different view. Instead of having your health deteriorating painfully for months and months, sudden death was not seen as something so disastrous. And that was an important lesson.
Thank you. So before I close, I want to briefly summarize what we heard across this discussion. First, patient preference studies work best when patients are involved early and in concrete ways, not just as participants, but in shaping what is studied, how questions are framed, and how results are understood and really communicated. Second, engage with patient communities is not a single activity. Panelists highlighted the importance of education, clear communication, and feedback loops, including the need for information to be shared in ways that are accessible, culturally appropriate, and meaningful to different patient groups. Third, representativeness requires intentional effort. Panelists described practical barriers related to access, language, technology, and they emphasized these issues must be addressed deliberately if patient preference studies are to reflect the populations who will ultimately use the treatments. Fourth, burden matters. Studies that try to answer too many questions at once can place significant cognitive and practical burden on participants, as well as emotional burden. Panelists underscored the need to balance study objectives with what patients can be reasonably asked to do. And finally, it sounds like there was strong support for the intent of ICH E22, alongside recognition that implementation will require clarity, examples, and continued attention to how patient input is translated into development decisions. So with that, I really want to thank our panelists for sharing their experiences and perspectives so candidly. Your input really underscores both the promise of patient preference studies and the practical considerations that need to be addressed to make them meaningful and effective. And so with that, I want to thank the audience for the engagement, and I'm going to turn back to Dr. Pignati for closing remarks. Thank you all.
Thank you, Robin. I thought this panel would be the most insightful part of today's program, and you have really exceeded expectations. Thanks to all panelists for sharing experiences and also encouraging us to further develop this guideline. And thank you, Robin, for moderating this fantastic session and really providing a lot of background also on the writing of the guideline. I want to reflect on some of the important points that you have outlined and I've picked up during the panel. I think the input and contribution of patients has long been recognized as essential for efficient and relevant drug development, but patient preference studies hold a special place here. They're part of a large body of established methodologies, which sometimes may look overwhelming, but the effort is worth it. As Francois highlighted, they help us to move from the anecdotal, implicit, to high-quality scientific studies that describe preferences explicitly and convincingly. As for any other study, patient preferences are not mandatory, and there may be also practical constraints, as we've heard. However, I trust that the many uses and purposes you heard from our panel and Brett earlier today and Ashley in the panel, their usefulness should become evident within and outside drug development. As we also heard, they also offer exchanges among patients and many other motivations that may otherwise be missed, as we heard from Naomi and Jason. And we want to do design patient preference studies mindfully of unnecessary burden and repetition. I was very pleased to hear that E22 provides a clear structure and concise principles for approaching this type of studies. It is important that patients, researchers, developers familiarize themselves with these established approaches and about the relevance and impact of the results of these studies. Where the education around patient preference studies falls outside the scope of this technical guideline, I hope that the E22 guideline will serve as a solid foundation, a very strong start, as Ashley phrased it, for systematically incorporating patient preference studies into drug development and evaluation. In closing, thank you all for participating today. We welcome your comments through your preferred public consultation channel and look forward to your feedback. I want to thank our speakers, panelists, and moderators for their excellent contributions, and to our E22 expert working group who put together the program. Special thanks to Charlotte Hallin for organizing this event, and to the colleagues from the ICH Secretariat for their continuous support throughout the development of the guideline. This concludes our webinar. Thank you and have a good day.